Okay. The parsha this week is Balak. And Balak is the king who hired the prophet Bilam to curse the Jewish people. It's a very curious parsha. And just by brief overview, the Jewish people at this point are encamped just outside the land of Israel. It's the 40th year since the Exodus. Aaron and Miriam have already passed away. Moshe remains the leader of the Jewish people. So we're really on the cusp of all the events of the Torah being completed, and then the prophet taking over with the book of Joshua and Joshua succeeding Moshe. That's the time we are in. It's a very curious parsha. And I want to start and just to summarize again, Balak, the king, ultimately hires Bilam, the prophet, and he's not a false prophet, he's a real prophet, to curse the Jewish people in an effort to prevent the Jewish people from passing by his land and entering the land of Israel. And we'll look at his motivation in a moment. Bilam works very hard to do so. And from 4 vantage points overlooking the Jewish people, he attempts to curse the Jewish people. But in keeping with the instructions of God, he can only state what God places in his mouth. And he ends up giving us 4 prophetic, positive prophecies, much to the annoyance and the anger of the king who hired him. And then the parsha concludes with a secret plan hatched by Bilam, which would be to entice the Jewish people into immorality, something that had never taken place since the time of Abraham in the history of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, in fact, are lured and they sin, and they're punished for that. And that's the parsha we have in front of us. I think the most profound question we can begin with is, why do we need this whole Torah portion? If you think about it, all the events taking place, Balak sending emissaries, hiring Bilam coming on the donkey, the angel of God standing in his way, the donkey talking to him coming, him looking over the Jewish people, in a significant way, they were non-events. The Jewish people weren't even aware of what was taking place the whole time. What do we need this for? What do we need to know about this? So there's a concept that some people explain, which is to open our eyes to the fact that as often as we've seen and we celebrate the Jewish people being rescued from harm and from danger and from ill intent, the fact is that there are many, many, many instances that we're totally unaware of haters of the Jewish people rising up to destroy us, to curse us, to prevent us from taking the next step forward in Jewish destiny. And oftentimes these threats are dissolved without us even being aware of it. So in a certain sense, as thankful as we are for the miracles of Passover and standing at Mount Sinai and the Exodus of the Egypt and Purim and Hanukkah and all the other things we celebrate, there probably are countless additional threats to the Jewish people that were taken away that we know nothing about. That's one explanation as to why this section is included in the Torah. We're going to look at it differently from that. And we're going to do so by giving consideration to the notion of who was Bilam. Strikingly and surprisingly, according to the rabbis, Bilam was a prophet on par with Moshe. Shocking statement. What does it mean that he was on par? And I'm not even going to go into all the details in the Midrashim about him having tattoos, wearing idols, having one eye, like being a very strange, bizarre, occult type of a person. How could this be equivalent to Moshe? What's the whole notion? And in fact, the way the rabbis phrase it is as follows. God, so to speak, was concerned that the nations of the world at the end of days would come to God and say, look, you sent a Moshe to rescue the Jewish people, such an incredible prophet, righteous person of greatness. If you would have sent the equivalent of that to us, we would have been just as righteous of the Jewish people. And again, there's room for all of us to be righteous, and that's the vision of the end of days, is that the entire world accepts God's dominion over the world. That's the definition of tikkun olam, that everyone becomes a world of humanity living under the dominion of God, recognizing God, worshiping God, praising God, thanking God. That's the vision. That will be the end of days. How many of us, Jews and non-Jews alike, are going to make it to that point? That remains to be seen. But that's the vision of the Torah. It's an inclusive vision. It's not an exclusive vision, and we're going to see details of that. But how could it be that God's response to the nations of the world was, okay, here's a Bilam? So, number one, it means that Bilam, as difficult as it's going to be to understand this, and we're going to make an attempt to do so, his access to God and his familiarity with God and his capacity to understand and perceive God in the world was equivalent to that of Moshe. Now, his prophecy can't be equivalent because the Torah tells us that Moshe was a unique prophet because Moshe conversed with God face to face, so to speak, without intermediaries, with a clarity that no other prophet could attain. But Bilam had all of that potential, and Bilam had all of that access to God. Yes, he never developed himself to utilize all of his talents and all of his potential to the level that Moshe did, but that's not a knock on him because no other prophet did. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joshua, even Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't reach a level of prophecy equivalent to Moshe's. That's what the Torah teaches us. But Bilam was the answer to that question. Let's try to explain this. So let's first get a key from Rashi in terms of looking into the Parsha itself. And we're going to see how this works. So the Jewish people are camped. The Jewish people have already fought some wars. They've already defeated other kings around the land of Balak, around the land of Moab. Now, also, the Jewish people have been clearly instructed that they're not going to fight a war with Moab. They're to circumvent any contact with them and not take them on. So Balak really had no threat of invasion by the Jewish people. Yet he was seized with fear, and he was seized with loathing of the Jewish people. That's what the beginning of chapter 22 tells us. It's page 856, 857 in the Stone Chumash. And that prompted him to seek out what he felt was the most meaningful, spiritual way of opposing the Jewish people. Now, he knew he couldn't defeat the Jewish people on the battlefield. He already understood that because of the nations around him that had stood up, attacked the Jews, and been subdued by the Jewish people. So he felt, okay, so let's use a spiritual means. And what we'll see, unfortunately, at the end of the Torah, he also used a spiritual means by attacking the morality of the Jewish people. Bilam ultimately succeeded in creating space, bringing the Jewish people off of their spiritual heights, which did in fact cause great harm to the Jewish people. Exactly how great that harm was is hard to evaluate, but there is a source and opinion that 1/4 of the Jewish people died as a result of the immorality that took place with the scheme that Bilam hatched. But we'll put that aside right now. Let's stay focused on what we're focused on. Why is this man so important? Why is this Parsha included in the Torah? What do we need these 4 prophetic blessings that we got from him? And if God wanted to give us those blessings, couldn't God have found a better way to do so than to view such a horrific person? So let's look at a detail in the Torah. Let's start with that. And again, we're on page 856, 857. It's chapter 22 in the book of Numbers. And we're going to look at a detail in sentences 7 and 8. Let's look at sentence 7 and 8. The elders of Moab and the elders of Midian went with charms in their hand, idolatrous charms. They came to Bilam and spoke to him the words of Balak, which were, come and curse the Jewish people. He, Bilam, said back to them, spend the night here, and I shall give you a response as Hashem shall speak to me. So the officers of Moab stayed with Bilam, and God comes to Bilam that night and talks to him. Again, look at the status that Bilam has. People come, they ask him, they offer him to hire him for a job. He says, well, let me check in with God and spend the night. You guys go to sleep here, rest up. I'll talk to God and I'll give you an answer in the morning. And God immediately appears and discusses it with him. Quite a high level of access to God. But what's missing here? What's the obvious question? The obvious question is, it says in sentence 7 that the people who came were the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian. And who spent the night there? Only the officers of Moab stayed. What happened to the elders of Midian? They disappear from the narrative. What's the answer to that question? Rashi, quoting a Medrash, explains that once Bilam himself didn't immediately agree to take on the job of cursing the Jewish people and knock us off of our pedestal and prevent the Jewish people from moving on to the promised land, they realized this isn't going to work. So the elders of Midian said, oh, if he's not signing up for the job immediately, and he has to talk to God to get permission to curse the Jewish people, they could foresee that this mission was a fool's mission, and they left. They went back and they said, no, not happening. Forget about it. And what's the concept behind them giving up so quickly? So the concept that's advanced by one of the commentaries is as follows. They, the elders of Midian, realized that there's no such thing as a father hating and cursing his own child. So look at the perception they had. They did go on a fool's errand. They were emissaries of a powerful King Balak. They approached Bilam, who has this tremendous access to God and is a prophet of a very high caliber of prophecy. But when they saw him demur, they immediately realized this is ridiculous. He's talking to God about cursing God's children? I'm not spending the night here. I'm done. This is going no place. And they leave. So we see right away, Rashi's pointing us to a dynamic, to a big insight here, that what we're dealing with here is a prophet of God, certainly a corrupted prophet of God, trying to work with God to undermine God's plan for God's children, the Jewish people. I mean, it's a pretty insane mission. At this point, I would just interject, perhaps that's why the Torah includes it. Because perhaps what the Torah wants us to be aware of up front here is how we human beings imagine ourselves being able to defeat God Almighty even when we recognize God as God. And if we think about our own lives, each of us could probably think of a few moments where we did think similarly. Yeah, it's wrong. It says in the Torah it's not good. It's against the morality that I believe in. It's certainly not something that my parents would ever have sanctioned. They'd be ashamed of me if they saw me doing it. But maybe there'll be some benefit. Maybe I should try it. Maybe I should pursue this path anyway. And the Torah, I want to raise the specter that the Torah is introducing such a scenario into the historical and spiritual awareness of the Jewish people so that we should at least become as wise as the elders of Midian and stop in our tracks and realize that we are embarking on a fool's errand here and no good is going to come of this. Back off. Don't spend the night. Don't continue pursuing a dead end, because when you really think through the scenario you're pursuing, you can see how self-defeating it is. So that's one important approach to understanding the importance of us learning about Bilam the prophet and us understanding this portion of the Torah, and ultimately us understanding the value of the 4 blessings that come out of this experience. Because it's almost like God can take any effort and fit it in to the destiny of mankind in the way that God wants it to be. And in fact, our emunah, our trust in God and our belief in God is that no matter how evil the intent is, and no matter how efficacious it may seem, it ultimately yields good for the Jewish people, good for the world. It ultimately advances the history of mankind in the direction that God intends it to do. That's a concept. It's a true concept. I'm not saying it doesn't sugarcoat all the horrors and tragedies of history, but it's something in the recesses of our heart when we feel taxed in terms of our faith in God and our trust in God. It's something that we could rely on. I'll just tell you a brief Hasidic story which relates to this. And I think it was the Chassid of Mezerich, an early Hasidic figure who was very, very sick and was dying. And it was a time when the Jewish people were in great travail and suffering from poverty and suffering from great difficulties. And he passes away. Before he passes away, all the students surround his bed and they say, please pray for us. You're going up to heaven. You'll be sitting in God's court. Pray for us. And he says, of course, and he passes away. Sometime later, some of these students, and it's a Kabbalistic Hasidic story, become aware that the man is not praying on behalf of the people. And they pray to God, open our eyes. Why is he not interceding for us? Why is he not praying for us? And they get the message back that he's looking at the world from a different vantage point, and all he sees is that things are progressing towards the ultimate goal of the world in an orderly way. And he doesn't see where he could possibly intercede that would be of benefit for the Jewish people. Okay, this is a story that doesn't fit everyone's mindset and everyone's circumstance, and it's not something that I would say to someone who's in the midst of dealing with tragedy or difficulty. But I think by the same token, it's something for us to associate here with the events of this Parsha, which has a tragic outcome to it, of ultimately the Jewish people being morally challenged and thrown off their spiritual pedestal for a time. But it all is part of the progression of the Jewish people reaching the land of Israel. And it's all part, it yields ultimately 4 blessings, albeit blessings that come out of the mouth or through the prophetic channels of a Bilam. Let's move on to a different source. Let's hold these thoughts. I think that they are important in accessing the Parsha. But let's switch gears now and let's look at Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. It's chapter 5. In my edition, it's Mishnah 22. In other editions, it's Mishnah 19. But we find the following Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, and let's listen to it. Whoever has the following 3 traits is among the disciples of our forefather Abraham. And whoever has 3 opposite traits is amongst the disciples of the wicked Bilam. This is a shocking Mishnah. Abraham and Bilam don't live at the same time. To associate the world in this way and to say, are you a student of Abraham or are you a student of Bilam? It seems like such a disconnect. And we're going to try to unravel the mystery of this Mishnah. Let's look at what it says. Those who have a good eye, a humble spirit, an undemanding soul are the disciples of our forefather Abraham. Those who have an evil eye, an arrogant spirit, and a greedy, demanding, ravenous soul are the disciples of the wicked Bilam. How are the disciples of our forefather Abraham different from the disciples of the wicked Bilam? Quite a question when you just explain these traits. The disciples of our forefather Abraham enjoy the fruits of their good deeds in this world and inherit the world to come. But the disciples of the wicked Bilam inherit a different future and descend into the well of destruction, and it brings sentences to support each one. So there's a lot to question and to explain about this Mishnah. Let's just go quickly. The structure of the Mishnah is whoever has these three traits is a disciple of Abraham. Whoever has these three traits is a disciple of Bilam. That's the introduction. And then it goes on to tell you, obviously, we could have condensed this Mishnah, and it could say whoever has these following three traits, A, B, C, is among the disciples of Abraham, and whoever has these three traits, D, E, F, is amongst the disciples of Bilam. So the structure of the Mishnah, interestingly, according to some commentaries, is that this is a Mishnah that applies to all mankind. And that's why it brings Avraham into the mix, because I've already mentioned the fact that Bilam is entered into human history to respond to a grievance of the nations of the world. If we would have had a prophet of the caliber of Moshe, we would have been just as righteous as the Jewish people. And God says, I'll prove you wrong. Here, take Bilam. Now, when you think about it, the founder of the Jewish people is Abraham. And what this Mishnah is opening our eyes to is it's not his belief and it's not his teaching. Ultimately, it's Abraham's character that is defining of the Jewish people throughout history. This is a big statement in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is written in such a way, according to the commentaries, that if you're a Gentile and you're interested in inheriting the legacy of Abraham, we know Abraham's name is he was the father of many nations. You don't have to become Jewish. You could rather simply perfect yourself in these three character areas, and then you also can live a glorious life, and you also can have a place in the world to come, something that amongst the major religions of the world, only Judaism puts forward the idea that you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy the world to come. And I can tell you many, many, many times, I have been told by very sincere, devout people, why don't you just accept a different ideology, because we really feel bad for you because you have no spiritual future unless you do so. A Jewish person could never say that to anybody else in the world. Because Judaism doesn't believe that. And this Mishnah, in a very significant way, lays down the foundational idea that if you want to ultimately be a disciple of Abraham, and disciples of Abraham are not necessarily Jewish, think about these three traits. Now, I'm not going to go into all three of them in the interest of time. Let's look at the first of the traits. To be a disciple of Abraham means you have an ayin tova. You have a good eye. And to be a disciple of Bilam means you have a bad eye. An explanation given by the Sfas Emes, and I think this is the significant wedge issue that I want to put forward here, and we're going to follow it through as we go back into the Parsha, is the Sfas Emes says it means being a positive person, simply insisting on only working on a level of positivity and not negativity. And in fact, then the flip side of this, an ayin ra, an evil eye, a bad eye, Rashi himself says it's a negative outlook. And Rashi defines the idea of a negative outlook is someone who is troubled by the tranquility of others. So let's put this down as a foundation point, and let's look at this as a wedge understanding so that we can really make this parsha come to life for us. You want to inherit the legacy of Abraham. The starting point is to insist on positivity. Insisting on positivity includes such things as working to eliminate jealousy, because after all, jealousy is just based on the idea of why do you have something and not me? There's nothing more negative than that. And as Rashi says on the flip side, the negative outlook is you're happy, your happiness bothers me, it troubles me, it angers me. And to use the words of this week's Torah meeting, it creates hatred. You know, the word used in this week's Torah reading when it describes Balak, the king, in his attitude towards the Jewish people, Vayokatz Moav. He was disgusted by the Jewish people. So look at what we're thinking about here. You have a king whose nation is not under threat from the Jewish people and who sees a historical trend unfolding. These descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they suffered. They were in Egypt. They were slaved. They were being eliminated from the stage of humanity. And somehow God rescued them. And somehow they've been wandering around for 40 years in the God-forsaken wilderness, and somehow they survived. And now here they are camped outside of the boundaries of my land. And I feel disgusted, angry, wrathful. I've got to take action to prevent these next steps from taking place of the Jewish people entering the promised land and fulfilling the whole legacy and the plan that becomes so manifest in the world of God dealing so specially with this people. This is what this parsha is about. This is the root of this parsha, and hence the Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, which is deciphering for us the character pillars of humanity and the world, starts off with this idea. This is what it means to have a negative attitude toward life. This is what it means to begrudge someone else's happiness. And Abraham established a legacy throughout human history built on the very opposite of that, on an ayin tova, a sense of, wow, I'm joyful that this other person is doing well, that they're living in tranquility. It brings a smile to my face to see others succeeding and progressing and enjoying life. That's what an ayin tova means. And this becomes a wedge issue in terms of who we ultimately are as people. And I'll show you how this plays out. We're going to look, for the sake of time, in blessings number 3 and blessings number 4 of Bilam. And they're on page 870 in the Stone Chumash, and it's chapter 24, sentence 5. And these are the most cherished words in the Parsha, in my opinion. But famously, on his third try, Bilam says, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. Words that we sing, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places of Israel. The words God is putting in the mouth of Bilam due to his prophetic powers and his attachment to God, are words that you can see he must have choked on every syllable. For him to look out, and as described by the rabbis, and see how the Jewish people were living in tranquility. They were living in ultimate contentment. There was no cloud of glory over them anymore because Aaron had died. There was no well of Miriam. There was nothing out of the ordinary, unnatural taking place. But what there was a few million people organized around the tent of meeting, around God's presence, living in tranquility, respectful of one another. Each tent faced in a direction so that each family had its own privacy. Each person could be content and happy to share not only their own progress and joy, but to share in the progress and joy of others. This is the blessing that came out of the mouth of Bilam, which you can see must have grated on every ounce of his nature. And it must have hurt him so much to utter these words. And this is the extent to which God's plan and God's viewpoint and God's destiny for the world overcomes whatever obstacles ultimately that we would want to throw at them. The fourth and final prophecy, which is on the next page, it's chapter 24, sentence 17. Let's read them in English. We'll go back to 16. The words of one who hears the sayings of God and knows the knowledge of the Supreme One, talking about himself here, Bilam, who sees the vision of Shakai while fallen and within uncovered eyes. I shall see him, but not now. I shall look at him, but it is not near. A star is issued from Jacob, and a scepter bearer has risen from Israel, and he shall pierce the nobles of Moab and undermine the children of Seth. Edom shall be a conquest, and Seir shall be a conquest of enemies, and Israel will attain success. And here, the stage that he is prophetically envisioning is the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people and of the world, which we have not experienced yet. We have yet not made it there. But Bilam himself couldn't help but articulate this ultimate vision. But let's look at what he writes, though, what he says, what he interjects. I shall see him, but not now. I shall look at him, but it's not near. And I want to add a significant thought here. To Bilam's ears, this is a curse. Because after all, Bilam is the agitator of the world. He's the person who has no rest if others are resting. So to him, when he sees a prophetic vision of the ultimate redemption, but it's not now, it's not near, it's not in the realm of the instant gratification and the immediate satisfaction which I'm seeking in life. So here is where Bilam's personal corruption is in fact tainting the very prophecy of God that he's giving forward. He's digging at us and say, okay, you Jews, yes, it's going to all be yours. Yes, there's going to be a time when the world will fully recognize God and everybody will understand that every action to support the Jewish people was a mitzvah, and every action to undermine the Jewish people was counter to God's will. But it's not happening so fast. It's not happening. Now, that's true, it's not happening so fast, but to him, that means it's useless. And it creates in the minds of us, the Jewish people, how long will it take? How much more time, how many more challenges will we have to overcome until we reach that point? And that's where Bilam is again expressing this ayin ra, whereas a person like Abraham, who was promised so many things by God and didn't see any of it come to fruition in his lifetime, he had no problem because he knew ultimately it's going to happen at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way. So in the end of assessing this week's Torah reading, what we need to cling to is the following idea. There are unbelievable threats and challenges to the destiny of the Jewish people, many of which we don't even know about. Our ultimate challenge is to remain disciples of Abraham and to avoid at all costs falling into the pit of becoming a disciple of Bilam. And when you look around the world today, by anyone's standard, Bilam has many more disciples, and their voices are so much louder, and they seem to be dominating human history. And the challenge to us is to look at this Mishnah and accept the idea that clinging to the values of an Abraham, clinging to the values of positivity, clinging to the values of humility and satisfaction and tranquility, and building positively the world around us, ultimately, like the Mishnah says, the disciples of our forefather Abraham enjoy the fruits of their good deeds in this world and inherit the world to come. As it says, to cause those who love me to inherit an everlasting possession, and I will fill their storehouses in this world. Proverbs 8:21. Look at the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Look at it often. Look at it in the background and in the context of the machinations of a King Balak and his prophet Bilam. Think about the immense spiritual potential that was poured into this prophet and how it was wasted and how it became an enemy of everything that's good, and unfortunately a voice that still speaks loudly today. And let us double down and renew ourselves by clinging to the vision of an Avraham Avinu. And let's maintain our ayin tova, our humility, and our sense of celebrating all the good in the world and all the good that we see, no matter who it is that's enjoying it.